they say madness doesn't arrive all at once. It creeps in like rot beneath wallpaper, like whispers through old floorboards. In the heart of Vermont's fog-draped woods, the Ashford estate stood silent for decades, a crumbling mansion swallowed by ivy, shadow, and something darker. When authorities finally entered the house in 1996, they found rooms untouched since the 1950s, a dining table still set for dinner, and something far more disturbing in the attic. A room filled with handwritten journals, each one chronicling a descent into absolute chaos, scribbled in different hands, all from the same family. 7 generations, 1 bloodline, 1 fate. The Ashfords weren't just reclusive, they were cursed. Madness didn't just run in their veins, it devoured them. But what really happened inside that house? Was it insanity, or something no science could ever explain? And if curses aren't real, why has no one ever dared live there since? The town of Renmore was always quiet, tucked between dense forests and winding, fogless roads in the northern hills of Vermont. Its population never climbed past 500. Generations lived and died there without ever leaving, buried beneath the same church bell that rang for their baptisms, weddings, and funerals. The kind of place where secrets didn't stay hidden, but were politely ignored, folded into the fabric of local folklore. Like stains on an old tablecloth, no one could be bothered to clean. It was there. In 1852, that the Ashford family first arrived, they came from England, with wealth, titles, and old-world mystery. Robert Ashford, the patriarch, had inherited a small fortune and purchased a sprawling property on the outskirts of Renmore. Locals whispered that he'd fled his ancestral home in Somerset after a tragedy. No one ever fully understood something about his younger brother, vanishing in the middle of the night and his mother retreating into total silence afterward. But it was never confirmed. What was certain was that the Ashfords built a massive estate of dark brick and crooked windows that seemed to lean under their own weight, as if the house itself was burdened by memory. At first, Robert Ashford was polite, cold but civil. He and his wife Eleanor kept to themselves. They had 3 children: Benjamin, the quiet eldest; Lydia, beautiful and aloof; and Thomas, the youngest, with an odd, stammering way of speaking that made shopkeepers uneasy. Though they rarely interacted with the townsfolk, the family became a fascination. Children dared each other to peek through the estate's wrought iron gates. Elders muttered prayers when passing the road that led to the Ashford house, especially after dark. By the early 1870s, the whispers grew. Benjamin Ashford had taken over the family business, though no one quite knew what that business was. The estate continued to prosper, but something strange had begun to unfold. Servants were seen arriving and never leaving. The few who did return to town avoided speaking about their time at the house. One young maid, just 16, arrived at her mother's doorstep in the middle of the night, barefoot, dirty, and trembling. She never spoke again, not one word. Her family claimed she'd been hexed, though the doctor called it hysteria. She died 2 winters later. By the turn of the century, tragedy became routine for the Ashfords. Lydia drowned in the estate's reflecting pool, fully clothed, no sign of struggle. Her body was found with her eyes wide open and a faint smile on her lips, as if she'd seen something comforting in the final moments. Then Thomas disappeared during a storm. No body was ever found, but months later, a journal belonging to him was discovered in the family greenhouse. The pages were soaked with water, but a few entries remained legible. One read, "The man with no eyes came again. He asked me if I'd told the others. I said no. He said good." By the 1920s, Renmore had changed, but the Ashford estate remained. Frozen in time, new generations of the family took over, and with each one, the mental health of its members seemed to deteriorate faster. Cousins who spoke in riddles, a granddaughter who refused to sleep indoors, an uncle who burned every mirror in the house before walking into the woods and never returning. Still, no one intervened. The Ashfords kept their distance, and the town returned the favor. The house remained a quiet wound on the edge of Renmore bleeding history, but never acknowledged. Then came Victor Ashford. Born in 1943, Victor was different, charismatic, handsome, and academically brilliant. He studied psychology at Yale and returned to Renmore with plans to cure the family name. He opened the estate's library to researchers, allowed interviews, and even held dinner parties. For local officials, people believed, briefly, that the curse had lifted, that Victor would be the one to finally untangle the threads of madness running through the bloodline. But something shifted after his mother's sudden death in 1971. She had reportedly been found sitting upright in the parlor, eyes closed, hands folded, as if peacefully asleep. But the official report listed cause of death as cardiac arrest, brought on by acute psychological trauma. What trauma? No one could say. Victor withdrew. The invitations stopped. The library was closed. One by one, the estate's windows were boarded up, mail piled at the gate. Food deliveries went unanswered. By 1974, it was as if Victor had vanished, but people swore they still saw him walking through the orchard at dusk, standing behind the curtains on stormy nights. A few even claimed to hear music from the house. an old phonograph playing the same waltz on repeat. It became legend. Children were told not to go near the Ashford estate. Teenagers, of course, dared each other to, but no one ever got close. Not really. Something about the place made your skin crawl long before you reached the gate. Then, in 1996, the town received an anonymous tip letter, written in shaky handwriting, postmarked from Renmore. It read only, "I think it's finally over. You can come now." When police entered the house, they weren't prepared for what they'd find, and neither were the rest of us. The front doors of the Ashford estate groaned as they were forced open, swollen from years of moisture and time. A thick, suffocating smell spilled into the morning air: mildew, rotted wood, and something far more difficult to name. Officers stepped into the grand foyer and were immediately struck by how still everything was, as if time itself had been trapped there. Gasping for breath, dust blanketed every surface. Cobwebs hung like curtains. Yet nothing appeared ransacked or disturbed. The house hadn't been invaded, it had been abandoned by choice. Except, not entirely. But in the sitting room, teacups still rested on the side table. A fire grate held the charred remnants of wood that hadn't been lit in decades. Upstairs, closets were full, beds were made. In the dining room, the long mahogany table was still set for 8 guests. Silverware gleamed in the light that filtered through cracks in the boards over the windows, but the chairs, they were all pushed back, as if the guests had stood up suddenly, or fled. Then they found the first journal. It was resting neatly on a table near the library door, its leather cracked and edges brittle. Inside, the writing was meticulous, dated 1975, and signed by Victor Ashford. The early entries were academic notations about the family's psychological history, theories about inherited trauma, references to Jung, Freud, and occult philosophy. But the tone shifted quickly. Within a few pages, the writing became erratic. Words were underlined, scratched out, rewritten over themselves. One entry read, "I've made contact, not with the spirit, no, with memory. The house remembers, the blood remembers. I was wrong to think we were sick. We are not ill, we are chosen." More journals followed. Dozens of them, hidden in drawers, under floorboards, even tucked inside hollowed-out books on the shelves. Some were written by Victor, others by family members long presumed dead. The oldest dated back to 1864, pages, yellowed, ink faded, but legible enough to piece together a horrifying pattern. Each generation of Ashfords experienced the same spiral. Visions, dreams of the orchard, whispers in the walls, paranoia, violent outbursts, disappearances, and, always, a mention of the man with no eyes. That figure surfaced again and again, described in different handwriting. Across decades, a tall man in a dark coat, pale as bone, face completely smooth, as if skin had grown over his eyes. He would appear in mirrors, in reflections, in dreams, always silent, always watching. Locals had their own stories too. A former caretaker, now in his 70s, told reporters that back in 1952 he was hired to clean the estate's greenhouse. He lasted 2 days. The place felt ... wrong. He said, "I kept hearing footsteps behind me, but when I turned, no one was there. And on the second night, I saw someone standing in the orchard, tall, still. Thought it was Mr. Ashford. I waved, but he didn't move, just stared. I left that night and never went back." A retired sheriff who'd visited the house in 1980 recalled getting a call from a neighbor reporting screaming from the estate grounds. By the time he arrived, the place was quiet, but he remembered seeing candlelight flickering in the upstairs window. "I called it in," he said, but nobody followed up. Everyone knew not to poke too hard into the Ashford business. There was something about that place, it made you want to look away. In Victor's final journal dated 1994, the entries were frantic, nonsensical. There were no line breaks, no punctuation. Just a continuous spiral of thoughts running down the page like blood from an open wound. One passage stood out. "I buried it, but it came back. The orchard wasn't deep enough. It wants more, it wants memory. I dream in other people's lives. I feel my father's fingers around my throat, and he is not dead. He is never dead. None of us. We are echoes, we are repetitions. We are. It ended mid-sentence, despite the heavy snowfall and deep frost. Officers discovered freshly disturbed soil behind the estate's greenhouse. Digging revealed 6 wooden boxes. Each contained bones, some human, some animal. One skull had its jaw pried open and stuffed with dried flowers. Another was missing its eyes. When forensics ran DNA tests, the results returned with a strange anomaly. While 5 of the bodies matched members of the Ashford lineage, one had no match in any known database. It was older, ancient, even estimated to be over 300 years old, and yet, buried with the rest. The orchard was another mystery. Despite the house being abandoned for years, the trees were in perfect condition, well-trimmed, healthy, bearing fruit, no rot, no weeds. Even in the dead of winter, the soil was strangely warm. Some officers refused to go near it. Then came the recordings. In a locked cabinet in the basement, investigators found a series of cassette tapes labeled only by dates. Victor's voice could be heard on all of them, disintegrating in real time. from clear, articulate narration to panicked mumbling and distant crying. On the last tape, dated just weeks before the letter was sent, Victor speaks directly to the microphone. "The house is awake now. I've seen the beginning and the end, and they are the same. I understand what we are. I'm sorry for bringing you here. No one should have come back." The tape ends with soft laughter, not Victor's, a deeper voice, hollow, almost amused. The deeper investigators dug into the Ashford legacy. The stranger and more fractured the truth became. It was no longer a matter of simply solving a mystery. It was as if the house itself had scattered the truth into fragments, daring anyone to reassemble the pieces. But some tried. The first serious attempt came from Dr. Helen Kessler, a forensic psychologist from Boston. She was brought in after reviewing excerpts from Victor's journals and listening to the tapes. Kessler had worked on high-profile cult deprogramming cases in the 80s, and what disturbed her most wasn't the rambling, paranoid tone of Victor's voice. It was how consistent the delusions were across generations. Different authors, different time periods, but the same figures, the same symbols, the same descent into terror. She called it ancestral resonance. Something happened in that bloodline, she wrote in her initial report. Something traumatic, possibly ritualistic. But it wasn't just passed down through stories. It seems embedded in their psyche, like a song everyone's forced to hum, but no one remembers learning. She noticed that every journal described the dreams, not just nightmares, shared dreams. A circular room made entirely of mirrors, an orchard where the trees whispered names, and the man, with no eyes, who stood silently beside a well that no one dared approach. Multiple Ashfords drew this man, dozens of sketches, all eerily similar: long coat, featureless face, disproportionately tall, always positioned near trees or reflections. Some pages had him drawn over and over, filling margins like an obsession. But more disturbing were the drawings that featured real people, family members, staff standing beside him, smiling. Dr. Kessler flagged this for immediate psychological review. But then the case was complicated by a physical clue, something tangible and deeply unsettling. In the attic, wedged behind a collapsed support beam, officers found a locked chest. Inside, a collection of personal effects, an ivory comb, a cracked porcelain doll, and a rolled piece of lambskin parchment covered in archaic writing and symbols. It was dated 1671, and though much of the ink had faded, one name stood out, clearly: Ashford de Vale. The name had never appeared in any Ashford documentation before. No portraits, no journals, no mention in family trees. Yet DNA pulled from hair, preserved in the comb, matched multiple Ashford descendants. Somehow, Ashford de Vale was not just connected, he was foundational. A likely origin point. But Asher's identity only raised more questions. A historian specializing in colonial-era occult practices was consulted. He recognized the name from a rare document out of England, one associated with early esoteric sects that predated modern satanic lore. Ashford de Vale was believed to be a mirror keeper, a kind of spiritual archivist for a secret order that believed mirrors could trap memory, and that through repetition of ritual and lineage, a soul could live multiple lives without interruption. They believed madness was not a disease, the historian explained. It was proof of awakening, the breaking down of barriers between who you are now and who you were before. This theory recontextualized the journals completely. What if the Ashfords weren't hallucinating? What if they were remembering? Further, evidence emerged from beneath the estate. A second basement was discovered behind a false wall, odor, stone-laid, filled with crumbling crates and candle stubs. At the center was a tall floor-length mirror. Though cracked across the middle, it had survived centuries. Etched along its frame, faintly but clearly, were words in Latin: Memoria non moritur. Memory does not die. The mirror was covered in dust, and when an officer attempted to clean it, she reportedly collapsed. Her account after waking was disturbing. She claimed to have seen someone standing behind her reflection, a man with no face, who whispered her name and reached forward. Others in the room reported no one there. The officer was taken off duty for psychiatric observation. She refused to return to the estate. She also refused to sleep in any room that had a mirror. The investigation turned toward the tapes again. Audio experts analyzed the final recording, Victor's last words. Gann discovered something chilling. When the laughter played at the end of the tape, a second voice could be heard in the background. Under the static, it wasn't speaking English. Linguists identified it as archaic French, and the phrase repeated was short and soft, but unmistakable. Tuise, moi, Tuise Pratt. You are me, you are ready. Victor's descent wasn't aimless. He was preparing. For what? No one could say. Journals, the tapes, the mirror, the sealed basement, and now the name Ashford de Vale. All clues pointed to something far older than a family's private madness. This was not simply a haunted house. It was a structure built to contain or preserve something, and the Ashfords weren't merely cursed. They were chosen, by blood, by legacy, possibly by design. And still, one journal entry kept surfacing. In everyone's mind, written by Lydia Ashford days before her death. We are pages in the same book, and he is the reader. Investigators packed up the evidence, but many never returned to rent more. Those who stayed behind developed insomnia. 2 reported seeing Victor on the edge of the orchard. 1 attempted suicide weeks later. There were still more tapes, still more journals, but eventually, the case was closed. Not solved, just left alone, because by then, it was becoming clear, no one was getting out of this with answers. Only echoes. The Ashford curse was not made of loud haunting, or flickering lights. It was quieter than that, slower, like the steady drip of water on stony roading, reason one memory at a time. Madness for them was not an event, it was a tide. Lydia Ashford's final days were perhaps the most documented. Her journal entries became increasingly childlike and tone words misspelled. Drawings in the margins, entire pages filled with the phrase, "He remembers me." According to a nurse who worked briefly at the estate, Lydia often wandered the halls late at night, dragging a silver hand mirror tied to a string. When asked why, she reportedly answered, "So he doesn't get lonely." Her death in the reflecting pool wasn't labeled a suicide. The coroner, unnerved by the expression frozen on her face, left the cause blank. But her mother, Eleanor, wrote something chilling in a letter to a family friend just days later. She died seeing something we were never meant to look at. Generations of Ashfords lived and unraveled in that house. And each, it seemed, experienced the same deterioration: first insomnia, then paranoia, then obsession. They all spoke of memory in ways that confused their caretakers. Victor once insisted that he could smell his grandfather's pipe smoke coming from inside his own lungs. Another descendant, Margaret Ashford, believed she had given birth to herself. She died in a private hospital, rocking back and forth in her bed, whispering, "I've already lived this." Again and again. This repetition of trauma was not only individual, it became collective. Family portraits were discovered, dating back to the late 1800s, where several members appeared to be looking in opposite directions from the painter's instruction, eyes always tilted slightly toward mirrors or glass windows. In one painting, a child is shown holding a reflection of a face that is not hers. Experts deemed it artistic error, but forensic analysis confirmed it. The reflection had male features. The girl in the painting had no twin. Victor Ashford, who tried the hardest to break the chain, left behind hours of audio recordings in which he sobs, not for himself, but for the entire bloodline. "It's not insanity," he says on one tape, "it's inheritance. We're born with ghosts under our skin." One of the most tragic moments came from a nanny's testimony. She was hired to care for the children of Edward Ashford, a distant cousin. She recounted a conversation with the youngest, a girl named Clara, no older than 5. Clara wouldn't sleep unless the mirror in her room was covered, the nanny recalled. "I asked her why once. She said, because it remembers me better than I remember me, and it wants me back." After that night, the mirror was removed. Days later, Clara carved a circle into the wood of her toy chest and filled it with teeth she'd pulled from her dolls. She said it was a mouth to talk to the other side. She was committed at age 12. The emotional toll extended beyond the bloodline. The local priest, Father Alton, tried for years to reach the Ashfords. He performed a blessing at the gates of the estate in 1982, but the next morning was found unconscious in the pews of his church, mumbling incoherently. When he came to, he claimed to have seen a garden of mirrors, each one showing a different version of himself, some screaming, some laughing, all slowly turning into someone else. "I don't know who I am anymore," he wrote in his journal, "and that's what scares me, not what I saw, but the way I wanted to stay." Neighbors also began reporting odd behavior. One woman, who lived within view of the Ashford orchard, claimed to see shadows standing among the trees, motionless and silent. Her husband dismissed it until the night he followed the shadows with binoculars. He swore he saw someone waving at him, someone wearing his own face. They moved away within the month. The isolation became its own kind of madness. The Ashfords stopped attending church, stopped visiting town, stopped appearing entirely. And yet, their presence grew heavier. The town felt it like pressure behind the eyes, unspoken dread. Children had nightmares. Pets wouldn't go near the road leading to the estate. A local teacher even banned the topic of the Ashfords in class after one student claimed her classmate was being followed by her own shadow and had started writing backwards during tests. By the time authorities entered the house in 1996, what they found was not just physical decay, was the wreckage of souls. Furniture untouched, beds neatly made, plates set, everything perfectly preserved. But emotionally, the place had been hollowed out. It was grief frozen into architecture. Victor's final writings hinted at resignation, but also guilt. "We are not victims," he wrote. "We are keepers. We chose to remember. We chose to carry this, even if it broke us." The deepest horror wasn't ghosts or spirits or apparitions. It was that the Ashfords may have welcomed the madness, believing that by doing so, they were preserving something sacred, some truth, too great for ordinary minds. And in their pursuit of remembering, They forgot how to be human. The official report on the Ashford estate case was quietly filed away in the winter of 1997. A single line summarized the findings. No foul play. Discovered. Property deemed historically unstable. No further investigation recommended. It was a bland, bureaucratic conclusion, one that didn't even begin to capture the horror waiting inside that house. But off the record, the case refused to die. Investigators, who'd stepped foot inside the Ashford home, began requesting transfers. One officer, Halstead Law Enforcement entirely, citing recurring dreams and an overwhelming sense of being watched, even in his own home. Another, a forensic tech named Miriam Ruiz, developed sudden-onset aphasia. She would stare blankly at photographs from the scene, unable to speak for hours. Her husband later found her standing in their bathroom, facing the mirror, whispering, "I know your name now." This didn't go unnoticed. Independent researchers, fringe journalists, and even paranormal investigators descended upon Renmore. In the years that followed, determined to uncover what the authorities refused to address, the most mainstream theory was psychological inheritance. Dr. Kessler, the forensic psychologist who had first examined the case, eventually published a private paper, never peer review, titled Architectural Madness, When Trauma Lives in Place. In it, she posited that the Ashford family had suffered from generations of compounded trauma, passed down not only biologically but spatially. She believed the house itself, its layout, its isolation, its mirrors acted as a kind of echo chamber for psychosis. Memory can leave an imprint, she wrote. When multiple generations experience trauma in the same space, that trauma becomes embedded in the physical structure. It reverberates. It shapes thought. It teaches the mind to fracture in familiar ways. But others weren't so convinced. By science, a lesser-known theory came from a man named Elias Mercer, a former seminary student turned occult scholar. He spent a decade researching the symbol found on the parchment in the Ashford attic, the one bearing the name Asher de Val. His conclusion was stark. The Ashfords weren't victims of mental illness. They were members of a forgotten sect, known as Les Miroirs Vides, the empty mirrors. This group, according to Elias, believed that mirrors were not merely reflections but doorways to alternate memory. By aligning oneself with a specific bloodline and completing a set of rituals passed down over generations, one could pierce the veil and access a state of perfect memory, not just of their own life, but of all lives ever lived in that family line. The catch: the human mind was not built to carry that weight. The process induced madness, purposefully. They weren't cursed, Elias argued. They chose to shatter their minds in order to become something more. They saw madness as a threshold. It's a theory that grew more chilling when a series of old church records from 1742 were discovered. In a collapsed archive in Bath, England, in those records among logs of births and deaths was a brief note about a landowning family named Ashford, who had fled overseas after violations of sacred glass rites and the unauthorized transfer of ancestral memory. This wasn't just coincidence. The timing matched the arrival of the Ashfords in Renmore almost exactly. Paranormal investigators took it further. One team, the HoloLens Society, conducted a covert overnight study at the abandoned estate. In 2004, they brought thermal cameras, EMF meters, and 3 trained psychics. What they captured remains debated, but the tapes show something strange. The temperature in the orchard stayed exactly 66.6 degrees Fahrenheit all night, even during snowfall, and one psychic came Lohouse while standing in front of the cracked mirror in the subbasement. On the audio recording, just before she faints, she can be heard saying, "He's behind the glass, and he has no name." She never returned to paranormal work. Then, there's the theory that never made it into any report or journal, shared only in whispers among those who saw the Ashford estate up close. A belief that none of this was illness, or ritual, or ghosts, that the Ashfords had been keepers of something old, patient, and watching, something that could only survive through memory, that needed human minds to echo through, and that it was still there, that it still remembers every single person who walked through that door. Perhaps that's why, when the estate was put up for auction in 2011, no one bid, not one. The land sits untouched to this day. Birds don't nest near it. The orchard continues to grow, its fruit never rotting. And sometimes only, on foggy evenings, passersby claim they hear music from the house. Faint, familiar, a waltz. The kind that makes you feel like you've heard it before. There's a reason why no one speaks the Ashford name in Renmore anymore. Not out of fear, not out of superstition, but something stranger, as if the name itself carries weight in the air. Like the memory of a nightmare you can't remember but still flinch from. As if saying it aloud might bring something back, not from the dead, but from somewhere much older than death. Somewhere, waiting. The estate still stands, though time has tried to claim it. The windows are veiled with rot. Ivy climbs the stone like veins, and yet, not a single pane of glass is shattered. Not a single mirror cracked further. The furniture remains undisturbed. The piano, though untouched for decades, holds its tune. There is a feeling inside those walls, not decay, but preservation. As if the house is holding its breath, locals whisper about the orchard, how the apples shine unnaturally in the moonlight, how animals won't enter its perimeter, how, on especially still nights, the scent of old perfume, something powdery and Victorian, carries on the breeze. And if you dare to walk too close, you'll hear it, not screaming, not footsteps, a melody, soft, almost maternal. A lullaby, maybe, or a ballroom waltz, long lost to time. The kind that doesn't just echo in your ears, but stirs something buried deep in your chest. A grief you never earned. A guilt that isn't yours. A longing that doesn't belong to you, but still fits somehow, because that's the true horror of the Ashford bloodline. Not the deaths, not the madness, not the cursed symbols or the theories, or even the mirrors. It's the way it pulls you in, like memory that isn't yours, trying to wear your skin. And it begs the question no one wants to ask. What if memory is a doorway? What if the brain isn't just a processor of experience, but a vessel for the past to crawl back through? What if, by stepping into that house, by looking into those mirrors, by even thinking the name Ashford, you open yourself to something ancient and hungry, something that doesn't just haunt you, something that remembers you? And maybe that's why the story still clings to the edges of forgotten town records, why faded photographs of the family are never quite destroyed, and why that single scrap of parchment found in the attic, the one bearing the name Asher Duval, now sits, quietly locked away, in the back of a private archive no one visits anymore. Because no one wants to be the next one who remembers something they never lived. The surviving town elder, Mrs. Evelyn Cray, once said during the last interview ever recorded about the Ashford family, that she had a dream shortly after the estate was condemned. In the dream, she was standing in the Ashford orchard, barefoot, surrounded by faceless children in antique clothing. One of them turned to her and whispered, "We're not gone. We're just waiting for someone to open the door again." When asked what door she meant, Evelyn simply smiled, a hollow, faraway kind of smile, and said, "The one inside your head." She died 3 days later, and perhaps that's where we leave this story. Not with answers, not with closure, but with a sense of something unfinished, as if the Ashford curse never truly ended. Just paused, waiting for the next mind soft enough to receive it. Because curses, if they are real, don't always strike like lightning. Sometimes, they seeped up through photographs, through names, through stories whispered on the internet, through videos. And now, you know the story. You've seen the faces, you've heard the names, and if tonight, when the lights go out, you catch your reflection lingering a little longer than it should in the mirror, if you hear a faint waltz playing where there should be silence, ask yourself, did you remember something, or did something remember you?